I grew up in northern New Hampshire, in a town small enough that you eventually recognized almost every face. In my early 20s, I was going through a rough transition. I'd recently ended a serious relationship, moved back home for a while, and had no idea what I wanted to do next. My grandmother suggested I start attending Sunday services with her. She had become deeply religious after my grandfather passed away. He had served in the military and was one of those men everyone in town seemed to know. His death hit her hard, but somehow her faith only became stronger. I wasn't particularly religious myself, but going with her gave me something to do. Then, one Sunday, I noticed someone new. She was sitting near the rear of the church, completely alone. She looked around my age, with short dark hair and pale green eyes. I'd never seen her before, which was unusual because our church wasn't very large. After the service, I introduced myself. Her name was Elise. We talked for almost 20 minutes. She was friendly, funny, and strangely evasive whenever I asked about herself. When I asked where she lived, she smiled and said, "Somewhere you haven't been." I laughed, assuming it was a joke. Eventually, she told me that she'd recently moved to the area with her mother and was attending a nearby college. We exchanged numbers. Over the next several days, we texted constantly. She told me her family life had been complicated and that she'd spent years trying to distance herself from certain relatives. I didn't press her. The following Sunday, she appeared at church again. This time, I asked her out. She stared at me for a second before smiling. "Okay," she said, "but promise me something." "What?" "If anything strange happens, don't panic." I laughed. I wish I hadn't.
Our first date was supposed to be completely ordinary. I picked Elise up on Friday evening, and we went to a small restaurant about 20 minutes from town. She seemed relaxed, but there was something different about her that night. Every few minutes, she'd glance toward the windows as if she expected someone to be watching us. I asked if everything was okay. She smiled and said, "I'm fine." After dinner, we walked around downtown for a while. We talked about college, music, and places we'd like to visit someday. For the first time, she seemed genuinely comfortable around me. When I dropped her off, she surprised me by asking if I wanted to take the longer way home. "There's a road through the hills," she said. "It's beautiful at night." I agreed. We left town and followed a narrow 2-lane road surrounded by thick pine trees. There were almost no houses and barely any traffic. For several minutes, everything felt peaceful. Then Elise went completely silent. I looked over. She was staring straight ahead. "Elise." She didn't answer. A second later, she began whispering. At first, I couldn't understand the words. They sounded like a language I'd never heard before. The strange part was that her voice didn't sound like her anymore. It was deeper, almost emotionless. I slowed down. "Are you okay?" Her head suddenly tilted toward the window. Then she said something that sounded like a sentence. I couldn't understand a single word. I reached for my phone, wondering if she was having some kind of medical episode. Then she turned toward me. Her expression had completely changed. She looked terrified, not angry, not confused. Terrified. She grabbed my wrist and whispered one sentence in perfect English. "Don't let them see me." I glanced into the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind us. But when I looked back at Elise, she was staring at the darkness between the trees. And then I saw something move out there.
For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. I kept driving, but my attention was fixed on the trees. Something had definitely moved. It wasn't a deer, at least I didn't think it was. The shape had been too tall, and it seemed to disappear behind the trees without making a sound. "Did you see that?" I asked. Elise didn't answer. Instead, she whispered, "Turn around." I asked why. She shook her head. "Just turn around." I made a U-turn at the next safe spot and started back toward town. For almost a minute, she remained completely silent. Then she suddenly asked, "What did you see?" I told her about the figure. Her face went pale. "You shouldn't have looked." That sentence bothered me more than anything else. I asked her what was going on, but she refused to answer. She kept looking through the rear window. Then my headlights caught something on the side of the road. A person. I slammed on the brakes. The figure stood motionless beside a mailbox. It appeared to be an older man wearing a dark jacket. I rolled down my window slightly. "Sir, do you need help?" The man slowly turned toward us. I couldn't see his face clearly. Then Elise screamed, "Drive!" I hit the accelerator. As we sped away, I looked in the mirror. The man was gone. I didn't understand how. There hadn't been anywhere for him to go.
Elise started crying. I pulled into a gas station near town and parked beneath the brightest lights I could find. She finally told me that her family had been involved with a strange religious group years earlier. She said her mother had escaped, changed their name, and moved several times. I asked what the group wanted. She looked directly at me. They believe some people can hear things that aren't meant for them. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. There were only 6 words. "You should not have brought her home." I showed Elise. She stared at the screen. Then she whispered, "They found me."
Elise refused to tell me who had sent the message. Instead, she asked me to drive her to her mother's house. The address was on a road I'd never heard of, several miles outside town. The farther we drove, the fewer houses we passed. Eventually, Elise pointed toward a narrow driveway hidden between the trees. That's it. The house looked abandoned. The porch light was off, the curtains were drawn, and there were no other cars around. Elise grabbed the door handle but didn't get out. My mother shouldn't be alone. We walked to the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was completely silent. "Mom?" Elise called. No answer. We checked the kitchen, living room, and hallway. Everything looked normal except for one thing. There were dozens of photographs covering the dining room wall. I stepped closer. Every photograph showed Elise. Some appeared to have been taken recently. Others showed her as a child. I asked who had taken them. Elise didn't respond. She was staring at a photograph in the center. It showed her standing beside a group of people I'd never seen before. Then she whispered, "That's where I grew up." I noticed something strange. In every photograph, the same man stood somewhere in the background. Sometimes he was near a doorway, sometimes he was standing outside, sometimes he was barely visible behind other people, but he was always there. "Who's that?" I asked. Elise backed away from the wall. "I don't know." Then we heard a sound upstairs. A single floorboard creaked. We both froze. I told Elise to stay downstairs while I checked. I walked slowly up the staircase. At the end of the hallway was a bedroom with the door slightly open. I pushed it wider. Nobody was inside, but there was a phone sitting on the bed. Its screen was glowing. A new message appeared. "You brought him here." My stomach dropped. Then another message appeared. "Now she can finally leave." Behind me, I heard Elise scream. I ran downstairs. The front door was wide open. Elise was gone, and on the floor beside the doorway was a single photograph. It showed me standing outside the church. The picture had been taken before I had ever met her.
I stood in the doorway staring at the photograph. It showed me outside the church, exactly as I remembered that Sunday morning. But there was something wrong. The picture had been taken from across the street, from an angle where nobody should have been standing. I immediately called Elise. Her phone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. I searched the house for any sign of her, but she was nowhere. Then I heard footsteps outside. I froze. Someone was walking slowly along the porch. I turned off the lights and stepped away from the windows. The footsteps stopped. A few seconds later, someone knocked 3 times. I didn't answer. Another 3 knocks followed. Then a man's voice came through the door. "She doesn't belong here." I recognized the voice. It was the man we'd seen beside the road. I backed away and called 911. While I was speaking quietly to the dispatcher, I heard the front door handle move. Then the house went completely silent. A few minutes later, headlights appeared outside. 2 police officers approached the house. I rushed outside and told them everything. They searched the property but found nobody. One officer asked me where Elise was. I explained that she'd disappeared. He looked confused. "What's her last name?" I told him. He checked his phone. Then he looked at me strangely. "There's no one by that name registered at this address." I thought he was joking. He wasn't. The officers checked the house records. The property had been vacant for almost 6 years. Nobody had lived there since the previous owner died. I showed them the photographs. They looked through them carefully. Then one officer stopped.
He pointed at a picture of Elise as a child. Do you know when this was taken? No. He turned the photograph over. There was a handwritten date. It was from 21 years earlier. That was impossible. Elise and I were nearly the same age. I suddenly remembered something she told me during our first conversation. Her family had moved to the area recently, but she had never actually told me where they came from. The officer looked at me. There's something else. He handed me another photograph. It showed Elise standing beside her mother, but her mother looked exactly like the woman who had been sitting behind my grandmother in church that morning. My grandmother. I couldn't breathe, and then I realized why Elise had looked so familiar.
I stared at the photograph until everything around me seemed to disappear. The woman beside Elise wasn't my grandmother. She only looked like her. The officer explained that the photograph was old, and the woman had been identified as someone connected to the family who once owned the house. But that didn't explain why I'd seen the same face at church. I drove straight to my grandmother's house. She was sitting in the kitchen when I arrived. The moment she saw the photograph, the color drained from her face. "You met her," she whispered. I asked what she knew. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she finally told me the truth. Years earlier, my grandfather had helped a young woman and her daughter leave a dangerous religious group operating in northern New England. The group believed certain people could receive messages from the dead. My grandfather had helped them disappear. But there was one condition. Nobody could ever try to find them. My grandmother had known about them the entire time. She had never told me because she believed the group was still looking for them. I asked about Elise. My grandmother shook her head. Her name wasn't Elise. She opened an old box and pulled out a photograph. It showed the same girl, only she looked younger. On the back was a name and a date. The date was more than 20 years old. I felt sick. That's not possible. My grandmother looked at me sadly. That's why I never wanted you going to that church alone. I asked where the girl was now. She didn't know. Neither did the police. The house was searched again, but Elise was never found. Her phone number disappeared. Her social media accounts vanished. And strangely, every photograph I had of her disappeared from my phone. I still don't know whether Elise was real, whether I had somehow become part of something I didn't understand, or whether someone had carefully constructed the entire experience. But there's one thing I know. Every Sunday since then, my grandmother still goes to church. She always sits near the back. And sometimes when she comes home, she tells me she saw a young woman sitting in the last row. A woman with dark hair. A woman who looks exactly like Elise. My grandmother says the girl never speaks.
Terrifying
she just
journey,
watches the door,
subscribe to
waiting for
Mr.
someone to
Nightmare
come in.
2.0 and become part of our growing horror community. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.